Hey, this is Bob from INSYDIUM. In this tutorial series, we're going to recreate this scene. In part 1, we're going to use NeXus particles to generate a fluid simulation. We'll make it move around angrily with a Vorticity modifier, and then we'll generate these foam particles, which will be used for render. Here we are in our base scene then. Let's have a quick look at what we have got. So here is an xParticle system, and you might see that we've actually deleted out some of the folders that we're not going to be using. We're not going to be using the old xParticle CPU modifiers, questions and actions and those folders. So we've just deleted those, leaving behind our NeXus quick folder, our emitters folder, and our utilities folder. So that's why that's looking a bit different to the default. Inside our emitters folder, we have one emitter setup, and you can see it here. It's inside this cylinder object in box mode. And if we go to the emission tab, we've got this set to shot emission in hexagonal grid mode. We're shooting out in the first frame, and we've taken all of the speed off, and the radius is on default. So if we go forward a frame, you'll see that we get a shot of particles, and they're kind of they're emitted in this hexagonal grid formation. The other elements of our scene here, we have our cylinder. Let's go to the utilities folder. We've got this cylinder which is called water container. So this is just a default cylinder that's been resized, made editable, and we've deleted off this top set of polygons, which makes our container. And then inside our water container, if we go to our Terraform Effects high-res rocks null, we've got these series of Terraform Effects rocks which have been positioned in this way. And these TF rock, if you don't know, is this nice procedural rock generator which enables you to create rocks based on shapes and then to kind of deform and add detail to those rocks. So we've got these ones which are called high res. These are going to be the ones we render, but we're going to be using them obviously to disrupt the flow of our fluid and get some nice swirly currents in our fluid sim, but we'll look at that in a moment. So first of all, we want our actually before we move on to the simulation settings, we have made a decision right at the beginning of this simulation, and that decision is we want to be able to almost simulate these so we can slow them down. We want to do a slow motion effect at comp time, and because we're using foam particles in this which are generated dynamically every frame, we're not going to be able to say retime the particle cache and get the slow motion that way. It won't work. So we have made the decision we're going to simulate this at 60 frames per second. And that means that in comp time, we can interpret that as a 30 frames per second video, and it'll play at half speed perfectly smoothly. So if I hit Control D for my Cinema 4D project settings and go to the project tab, you can see, look, I've changed the default frames per second. By default, I work in 30 frames per second, and I've doubled this to 60. So this means we've got to simulate twice as many frames, but it means at comp time, we can get that really nice slow motion effect, which is going to be useful for this render. So we've set that to 60. One thing that is worth doing, if you ever change your frames per second for this reason, I always like to go to the render settings immediately to get the render settings to match, because it's easy forgotten and then you've got to re-render the whole thing if you get it wrong. So let's go to render settings, and in the output, let's just make sure that frame rate, we're going to change it from the default 30 to match our project frame rate of 60. And now I know that that is done. Cool. Right, so let's have a look at these particles. You can see that our particles are in this box emitter, and they're going to be pulled down into our container and create this fluid sim. Let's go to our water container and just go to the basic tab and put it in X-ray mode so we can see through it. Now this water container is going to need a collider tag, so our particles get trapped inside. So let's go to tags, extensions, INSYDIUM tags, and get this XP collider. Now we need to set the normals to be inside the object because we don't want to trap them inside. So we've switched that around. Let's take the bounce off, and that is our collision object. Very nice. Now we need our particles. We need two bits of physics going on here. We need a gravity force to pull them down, and we need a fluid solver so they interact with each other in a fluid-like way. So let's go to our NeXus tools, and we'll first bring in a NX gravity. There you are. Just leave it on the default, and we'll go to NeXus, and let's bring in the fluid solver. We're going to go to NX fluids. We're going to leave this in SPH mode. Let's put the substeps up by 1 to 4. So now these particles will behave in this fluid-like way. Let's hit play, and we'll see that the gravity will pull them down to the surface. And we get a nice splash, and then moving around. We've got a problem is that some of the particles that were born outside the container are just infinitely falling and falling and falling. So we don't want that. So let's set up a custom kill modifier to get rid of any of these particles that are born outside the container. So we're going to go to NeXus, bring in an NX kill. There you are. Now the NX kill, we can actually use this cylinder. So for the volume, instead of it just being this default cubic bounds, let's just change it to object. Let's drag in our water container. There we are. And this little symbol is saying if the particle is outside the object, kill it. So that's what we want. One last thing though, we can just tick only born, so it's more efficient, and now it's going to get rid of those particles when they're born, and then the rest of them are left. Cool. So we've got this going on. We've got this drop, and then we've got our fluid moving around our container, but it is not interacting with our rocks yet because our rocks don't have a collider tag on them. So what we're going to do is our rocks, if we hit NB to show the lines, you can see they're fairly high resolution, quite high poly count, and there's no need to have to calculate collisions with something as polygon dense as this. But this is the cool thing about terraform rock, is that we can create some much lower poly collision objects which will be pretty much, well, exactly the same size and based on the same shape, just not as much polygon detail. So the way we're going to do that is, look, let's just highlight this null, hold control, drag it to make a copy, put that in our utilities as well, and in the copy let's just rename it straight away, and let's just call this one Terraform Rocks Collider, and we'll make our high res ones invisible now, and we don't need to look at those again until render time. So we'll render the high poly ones, but we'll use low poly ones to simulate. So let's just open up our rocks, and what we want to do, let's just select all of these rocks, and what we're going to do is go to the object tab, and look, we're not going to go through all of these settings, but all we need to do is reduce the subdivisions, and you'll see that, look, they're retaining pretty much the same shape, but obviously they're way lower poly. Now the collisions are so fast in NeXus with the new collisions engine that actually there isn't as much reason to do this anymore. You get really fast collisions even with high poly meshes, but I think it's still very good practice to always optimize simulation scenes as much as possible. So let's go with this. We'll go with one level of subdivisions. All right, and now what we want to do is give these a collider tag. Now to get them working with just one collider tag, what we can do is, look, let's go to our utilities folder, and we're going to bring in an XP join object. Let's drag our null inside the join. So now all of these low res rocks have been joined. We can just put one collision tag on this join. So let's highlight it, tags, and we'll go with extensions, INSYDIUM, collider, and we'll just take off all of that bounce. Cool. We'll minimize that. So now we have got that, we should have a little bit more fluid particle movement here because they're colliding with the cylinder internals, but also, yeah, look, they're bouncing around those rocks. And if we make the rocks invisible, yeah, you can see, look, those collisions are taking place and they're not able to penetrate those rocks' volume. Very nice. Right, so we've got our fluid sim going, but there's not much energy in this, is there? It just kind of, we get a bit of a splash and then it comes and settles to a stop pretty quickly. One thing we could do, we want to encourage some nice swirling and movement in here. So what we could do is on both our collider tags actually, we could just put our friction on 0. So there's no friction from those collisions at all. So the fluid is free to move around unimpeded, which will just mean it'll slide and will allow a bit more energy in the scene. Good. So now what we're going to do is use another tool to get that really cool swirly energy. We're going to go to NeXus and we're going to bring in an nxVorticity. And let's bring it under the fluids. And what this vorticity is going to do is it's going to analyze this particle fluid movement. And where you get these natural swirls and eddies, it'll kind of exaggerate those and build on those. And we can get some really aggressive currents using this tool. If we hit play just with it on the defaults, we're not going to see an awful lot of difference in this sim. But let's put this strength way up to say 600% and hit play. So we've massively increased the speed and you're going to see that we've got a lot more movement. Look, can you see that it's kind of maintaining the momentum of this sim a lot more, and these swirls are starting to build and kind of staying alive. The energy isn't kind of dissipating as it was before, so that's already working on those settings. Let's put the radius up a little bit. This will include more particles for every one particle. We'll search for more particles, which means there's more vorticity data going on there. It can also lead to larger swirls, increasing this radius amount. And now we're starting to get some nice energy developing in this scene. So one thing that I want to do here is we want there to be a very strong force from this vorticity. But then we don't want it to get out of control. And vorticity is a force that's kind of always adding and adding and adding, which means that it can get out of control very quickly and you start kind of losing the shape and it just looks like the water's boiling. So what we can do is have a really strong strength, but then limit the force, limit how much force is allowed. And it's a nice way of balancing this. So we get loads of good movement from the strength, but the force limit keeps it under control. So to demonstrate this, look, let's put our strength way up to say 150. So really, 1,500. So really, really strong. If we do this, we're going to start seeing, yeah, I mean, look how much energy that has put in this. As I said, we've got almost that boiling water effect of this being so energetic. And it's building and building and building to the point where it's getting out of control. So here's where we can bring the force limit in. Let's limit this so it's really strong, but we're limiting it to 20. And what you're going to see is we're going to get really heavy, aggressive vorticing, but that force limit is keeping it under control and those splashes aren't getting too much. So something like that is looking really cool. Now later on in our sim, we're running this. If we go to our emitter, we are running this in hex mode with a particle radius of 3 centimeters. Later on in this sim, we're going to reduce this particle radius down to get more particles and more detail in the scene. And what you're going to see is when we have more smaller particles, we will need to reduce the vorticity strength to get a similar look. In fact, we could look at doing that now, couldn't we? Let's go and just put our radius on 2 centimeters. So this will massively increase the particle count. And you'll see that it's going to run more slowly in the viewport because we've got loads more particles. But you can see with a larger particle count, smaller particles, the vorticity is way, way too strong. So we're going to have to adjust that and turn it down. But we're going to leave our particle count a bit smaller. So let's put our radius back to 3 whilst we introduce the next modifier into this. And then when it comes to caching our fluid sim before we set up the foam, we'll put this radius back down to 2 is going to be the radius we're going to go for our production cache. So we're back on 3, and the first bit of energy has been provided by the splash of particles and then the vorticity exaggerating all of these swirls. We're going to introduce a new bit of energy into this scene at around frame 250 for the next kind of bit of particle swirling, and we're going to do that using a NeXus rotate modifier. So let's go to NeXus, and we're going to bring in a nxVorticity. There you are. Let's bring that under our vorticity. Now our NeXus rotate, if we just move our camera, let's hide some of this viewport furniture so we can concentrate on what we're looking at. So in our emitter, let's go to the display tab, and we can switch off draw emitter, which will just get rid of that bounds. Okay, let's go to our gravity, and we can switch off the visible in editor. We don't need to see that. And now let's have a look at our rotate. Now our rotate, if we move it to the side, it's rotating in the wrong direction. Look, it's rotating on the arrows pointing this way in the plus Z. So it's rotating in this, and we want it to rotate around this y-axis. So let's go to our coordinates, and we'll set the pitch to be 90. And now you can see it's facing upwards. That's what we want. Very good. And we want this to be exactly in the center of our cylinder. Now here's a slight issue. If you go back to our NX rotate coordinates, and let's just zero out our coordinates, 0, you can see that we have inherited a cylinder collider that isn't exactly at world 0, because our rotate's at world 0 and it's not in the middle of the cylinder. So that is not going to work for us, is it? So let's here's a quick way of getting that perfectly to the center of our cylinder. We'll just take our rotate, make it a child of our water container, and then we'll zero out this Z axis, and there we go. Look, we've got it exactly in the center. That's what we want. So then we can move it back into our modifier stack. Excellent. So now if we hit play, the rotator's on, just on its default settings. If we hit play, we're going to get the splash, and you can see that the particles are being rotated around in this swirl. So that's looking pretty neat, isn't it? But we don't want it to happen straight away. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave everything pretty much default, but we're just going to keyframe this rotate speed. And I think when we want this to be in its full whack setting, I think we want quite a high rotation speed of maybe 360. And that's going to look something like, yeah, so quite a strong rotation. But what we'll do is we'll start the scene with our initial splash without this rotate switched on. So let's have a look at when we want it to start. So we get our initial burst of energy with a splash, and we get these really nice splashing up particles, and with the vorticity we're starting to get some nice swirls. And this is, we don't want to kind of disrupt any of this just yet with our rotate, because we're getting some nice movement. So maybe somewhere around here we now want to instigate the rotation. So let's put our rotate speed on 0, and we'll go forward a few frames. So we want this to build up, have a nice bit of rotation, maybe up to 350, and we can put that up 360 degrees, hit another keyframe, and then we want that rotation to stop, and the vorticity will do its thing with that rotational movement and make some nice kind of rotating eddies. So we put our timeline now to 442. Let's put that back down to 0. All right, that looks cool. So let's just have a look at what we've got. Initial splash. That's it, NA to hide those lines. Initial splash, and we're getting this nice vorticing. It's looking really cool, this choppy water. And now our rotation is going to start easing in as those keyframes come into effect. So we're not getting enough movement there from our rotate. Let's have a look at our oh, I've not switched it on. That's why. Genius, Bob. Okay, let's try again. I thought that rotate looked slightly too weak. I didn't realize it was completely switched off. Okay, so here we go. Our initial vorticing looking good. Our rotate is going to start coming into force now. Here's the keyframe. Here we go. And yeah, it's getting stronger. We can get that rotation coming in, but then it tails off just enough to get it swirling. And then the vorticity will kind of exaggerate and keep these swirls going. That's looking really cool. That's all we need to do with the rotate. That's looking excellent. So the final bit of movement that we used in our render was we got a final splash of particles. And all we need to do here is just add another emitter and do a new emission drop. So let's go to our XP emitter. We're going to go to the display tab again and then just switch back on that draw emitter to get the box back. And with this emitter, I'm just going to hold control, grab this Z axis and drag it to make a copy, but move it over here, maybe something like that. And with this second emitter, let's go to the emission tab, and we don't want this to emit on frame 1. We want this to emit on somewhere around here. We could say frame 589. That's fine. Let's go frame 589, something like that. Okay, so let's have a look at our new sim then. So we've got our original splash with our vorticing, and then I really like the way this rotation kind of smoothed in. We got a nice kind of build up to a quite an aggressive kind of whirlpool look, but then it was allowed to tail off and the vorticity could just take over and kind of maintain the swirl. So here it is. This is looking, I really like this, and I like it the way it's being forced through the gaps of these collision stones. So that's cool. Okay, so now we're getting into frame 500. We're getting close to our second emission. Now this is going to create a really big splash. Big splash. And when it comes to getting our foam in there, that secondary splash is going to look very cool and get some really good movement. Alright, so I'm pleased with that. That's looking very nice. So those are our 3 bits of dynamic particle motion. Original splash, the rotation, and then the secondary splash. So now we've kind of got this sorted. This is looking nice. We need to kind of get ready to cache this out, and we'll start looking at the foam particles using the cache. So to do that, before we start caching, remember we wanted to up our particle count and we wanted more smaller particles. So let's highlight both of our emitters, go back to the emission tab and set our radius to 2. Now we're going to have to make some adjustments to our vorticity settings because this is going to be too strong. Now we've got a kind of a higher particle resolution sim. These settings are going to be too strong. So let's just have a look. We're going to have to massively reduce this strength. I would say down to maybe in the hundreds. This is definitely too strong at the moment. Everything's been broken apart by the vorticity. So let's bring this down to, say, let's try 400. But my gut feeling is we're going to go even lower than that. Let's have a look. So it's looking pretty good. Looking quite angry and noisy already. What we don't want is that kind of boiling effect where we've lost all of the swirls. And I think we perhaps have a fractionally too much. Let's go down to 200 vorticity. Give it another playthrough. So obviously you need to use your eye, use your judgment. At this point, because we're not getting real-time playback, it'd be a good idea to do a couple of hardware renders at different strength settings, and then when you play those back in real time, you can get a real feel for how this fluid is moving around. That's looking nice. So we're getting some really good vorticity here, some really good swirls, but you can see that we've maintained the shape. It's not too boily and noisy. So a strength of 200 in this scene That's working really, really well. I like that a lot. Right, so we're going to prepare this to cache now. The only thing that we need to look at is, at the moment we have 1200 frames in our timeline. Now our secondary splash happens just before frame 600, and we don't need a huge amount of frames after frame 600. We're going to get that secondary splash, and that's when we edited out our beauty. That was the last kind of stab of the animation. So I'm going to say, just to be safe, look, let's limit it to 800 frames. I don't think we'll need that many, but let's go with 800. And then we need to cache far fewer frames than what we had before. Cool. So I think we're ready for a cache now. Let's go to our utilities. Let's go to our XP cache. And we're going to cache to external files. I'm just caching this to my documents. You cache it to a folder appropriate for your project. We're going to compress the cache on build. Yeah, everything's included. That's looking good. So let's build cache. So what I'll do is I'll pause the video here as usual, and I'll come back to you when this cache has finished. We'll have a look at the result and I'll tell you how long it took. Okay, and that cache is finished. Let's just have a look at the details. It took just under 5 minutes to complete, and we can now scrub through our sim, and that's all looking very cool. Okay, so now that we have got that sorted, we're able to move on to our NX foam. So for this render, we're not going to be rendering any of these fluid particles at all. We're not going to be meshing the fluid particles. All we're doing is using them to generate some foam particles. And that's what we're simulating, and that's what we're rendering. So let's have a look at what we need to do to get that sorted. Now with our foam particles, we can switch off a lot of these modifiers now because we don't need them. We don't need the fluids because they're cached. We don't need the vorticity. We don't need the rotate. With foam particles, you do have to have a gravity in your scene because it uses the gravity as part of the kind of the buoyancy and the advection calculations. So this gravity needs to remain active, so we'll keep that one active. So let's just make our fluid particles invisible. We don't need to look at those, and we're going to go to NeXus and we'll bring in an NX foam. There we are. Now the NX foam, it requires two things. As we said, it needs a gravity in the scene. So we've got a gravity here, so that's fine. And it also needs an emitter. So let's create a new emitter. This is going to generate the foam particles. So just click on this button and then let's just bring that into our emitters folder. And I'm going to just change the name of that one. We'll call that emitter foam. All right. Let's go back to our NX foam settings. Now, mercifully for this scene, we have to adjust very few of these settings to get the look that we want. In fact, we're only going to change 2 or 3 of these, and we're not going to go into huge detail about what all of these settings do in this tutorial. If you do want to take a deep dive into how all of these settings work and how they generate and move the foam particles, there is a detailed video within the official Fused manual in the NeXus manual. So if you just go to the INSYDIUM website, look for the manuals, and in the NeXus section, as I say, there's a very long detailed video that describes all of these settings and what they're doing. The basics: there are 2 types of foam particles that get produced. Ones that get created by the crests of waves, these crest particles, and others where 2 fluid particles trap air when they pass by each other very quickly, and they trap air in between and create these kind of impact air particles. Those 2. What we're going to do is put our crest rate down to 10, our air rate down to 10, and almost everything else we're going to leave default. The only couple of changes we're making to the emission of our foam particles is we're going to have them be created after 35 frames. So this is saying that a fluid particle is able to create foam particles once it's 35 frames old and above, and there's a bit of variation in there as well. And then the life, we're just going to turn this down to maybe 200 frames. So it means that when a foam particle is generated, it'll float around on the surface of the fluid for 200 frames before it dies. And we have a bit of variation there as well. And all of these other settings for generating our crest and air particles, we're just going to leave in default. They're going to work perfectly for us. The only other setting that we're going to change is in the advection settings. So here, the emission settings are how you generate the foam particles. The advection settings are how they move within the fluid. And all we're going to do is we're going to increase this drag value up to almost 100, so they really move around with that fluid and almost kind of stick to the point in which they are generated. And that is going to really nicely exaggerate some of the kind of the choppy swirls. And that's it. That's all we're doing to our foam. So now let's just have a play. Now in our scene, we've got a lot of particles here, and we're going to be generating a lot of foam particles. Actually, look, we've got the display mode set to squares, which is a bit too big for foam. We want them just to be tiny dots. So let's go to our emitter foam. Let's go to the display tab, and we'll just change the editor display from squares to dots, and then look, we can just force display, which will update straight away. There we go. Yeah, so now we can see those foam particles. And if I just move that camera down a bit, you'll start seeing some of that detail. So the foam particles are generated, and you can already see the detail and the swirls that we're getting from those foam particles. It just looks brilliant, doesn't it? For free. NX foam works so well, and the default settings are so spot on. Often you just need to shove it in your scene and press play, and you get something looking fantastic like this. So this is looking really good. I'm happy with that. You could play this all the way through, look for all of your splashes and what happens when it rotates, maybe even do some hardware renders to get an idea for the movement, and then make adjustments. Obviously it's all kind of time dependent, how long you've got to spend on your project. But for me, this is looking good. So what I want to do now is cache these foam particles out. But before we cache them, this is important. I want to use the particle speed of these foam particles to drive their colour. If you remember from the beauty, we have kind of multicoloured glowing foam particles, and we're going to drive that multicoloured gradient using the speed of these. So to do that, we're going to use another modifier. We're going to use an NX colour modifier. Let's go to NeXus, and we're going to bring in an NX colour. And this one, we're going to do gradient by parameter as the colour. And the gradient, we just want grayscale here actually. So look, we can get rid of these knots. And in this blue one here, let's just change that so it's just black. So there we have a grayscale gradient. And we want to map it, by default it's mapping it to the age of particles. So when the foam particles are born, they'll be born black and they'll gradually get whiter over their life. We don't want that. We want it to be mapped to the speed. So let's get the speed, something like that. And let's put this on maybe 400. As a guess, max speed. So it's saying that particles that are stationary will be black, and as they get faster, they'll get lighter up to a max speed of 400 where they'll be fully white. So we'll be getting a nice mix of colours there. I think we are. It's looking pretty good. Could maybe go to 380. I'll just brighten them up a little bit. So let's just keep this running until we kind of move on through the scene. So yeah, you can see the fast moving swirls. So these will be one colour and the darker ones will be another colour, but we'll also render these with an additive material. So where we have these areas of lots of overlapping particles, they'll be glowing almost to a white. So we're going to get a really, really nice effect. So that's looking good. I'm pleased with that. That's excellent. Right, so let's just hit pause. Now we're ready to cache these out. So let's just go back to our XP cache object. Now, we need to get this right because we have already cached our fluid particles and we don't want to touch that cache. And we've also switched off our fluids and vorticities, so we have to leave these ones untouched. So here's what we can do. With the same cache object, we can just go to build cache. So we'll click it once, build cache. This is the important bit. Do not overwrite, because if you overwrite, it's going to try and recalculate our fluid emitters, and that's going to mess up. We don't want that. But if we hit continue, it will ignore our already cached emitters, and it will just cache the ones that doesn't have any cache data, which is the foam, which is what we want. So we hit continue. It's going to work through this cache. So again, let's pause it here and I'll come back to you when it's finished. Okay, and that cache has finished, and that took a bit longer because we've got way more particles. That was just under 35 minutes there. So now that we have got all that cached, let's switch off our two fluid particle emitters because we don't need to be looking at that. And then we can scrub through this and you can see that we've got our cached foam particles. And we've got, you know, a lot in the scene. Look, if we get to this really heavy bit where we've got loads of particles created, look, over 3 million at this frame. Now, if you want to improve your kind of viewport playback of these cached particles, we can reduce how many we're viewing in the viewport. Let's go to our emitter foam, to the display tab, and look, we can go to our LOD, level of detail, just reduce this down. We don't need to be drawing all of those particles. Put it down to say 15%, and now this will kind of scrub around a lot easier in the viewport. And you can see we've got our fluid particles. Let's have a look at this final splash section. There we've got our particles splashing in, and they're looking really good. Excellent. So now we have got our simulation finished. Remember, we're only going to be rendering our foam particles as this. So everything else now, everything is done. We can switch everything off apart from these foam particles, and we'll start setting up our render with materials and how we're going to set up the cameras in the scene in part 2 of this video.